The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I am the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Environmental Influences on Children's Health and Development. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the Consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them. Today's webinar will be recorded. After it ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel and will share that link with all registrants. Please feel free to share the link widely. And now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Susan Buchanan to introduce today's topic.
Great, thank you very much. Let me know on the chat function if you can't hear me. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I am the first speaker on that list of three speakers. I'm at the Great Lakes Center for Children's Environmental Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago at our School of Public Health. And I am director of the EPA-funded Center on Children's Environmental Health here called the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, and I will explain a little bit more about that later on because we are a resource for you and I want you all to know about it. Okay, next slide. Thanks. This is an acknowledgement and disclosure slide for all three of us that are speaking today. I receive funding from the EPA and ATSGR, as I mentioned. There's also funding from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. This slide has, I love historical pictures, and this slide has some pictures from history that illustrate either disasters that occurred because of environmental exposures to children or just show the role of the environment in children's health. The top left is a Dutch boy white lead paint advertisement. And as you probably know, lead paint has been the scourge of the children's environment for the past at least 100 years. And one of the reasons is that there was a lot of lead in paint much longer in the US than there was in other countries, other advanced countries like European countries. In the US, we had lead in our paint until at least the late 50s, and there were some that went on into the 70s. So that's why we continue to deal with lead poisoning in children from exposure to older homes. And one of the issues in the US was that the lead paint companies had a lot of power. An American lead company had a lot of power in the US and used this type of advertising. There's a really good article in the American Journal of Public Health that discusses how the paint companies, the American lead, chose a child in this Dutch boy icon to promote the use of paint in nurseries, insisting that they were safe, insisting that the lead paint was safe, and that you should paint your child's bedroom and the newborn's room with lead-based paint. Below that is a photograph, a famous photograph from Life magazine from Minamata Bay, Japan. This is a village that suffered mercury poisoning after an industry discharged mercury into the bay on the other side of the bay where the villagers lived, and the villagers subsisted on fish that had been contaminated with the mercury, and mothers gave birth to children with severe birth defects shown here in this slide. The top right, I will talk about in a minute, but is a photograph from the Dutch famine during World War II when Amsterdam was cut off from incoming trade and had no food for a very long winter. And there was research conducted years after this famine to look at the effects of the famine on women who had been pregnant during that time, and looked at the effects on the offspring. And then the bottom right is an ad for teething powder, which also was contaminated with mercury, and there were fatalities, numerous fatalities in the United Kingdom in children who had the tooth powder used on their gums to relieve the pain of teething. Next slide. We focus on children when we talk about the environment because children are uniquely vulnerable compared to adults. And this slide shows one of the main reasons that children are uniquely vulnerable. They are mechanisms that breathe, eat, and drink more per body weight than adults. So they're the little metabolic machines. In order to grow, it takes a lot of air and food and water. So down below, it shows you the breathing and food intake and water rates compared to adults. So kids breathe 400 milliliters per minute per kilogram versus 150 in adults. So per body weight, they're breathing more air. They're eating 45 grams per kilogram per day versus adults that eat 10 to 15 grams per kilogram per day, except for today, which is Valentine's Day. So I've already, I think, passed my quota just on chocolate and other candy today. And then water, 28 grams per kilogram per day among children versus 5 to 10 for adults. So you can imagine if there is a contaminant in the air, in the food, or in the water, the child is going to be exposed to a higher concentration. This is another main reason that children are uniquely vulnerable. Look at this slide, and I want to highlight the density of the neurons that are found on this slide. On the far left is a graphic of what the density in a newborn's brain looks like versus a 3-month-old versus a 2-month-old. So you can see the dramatic change from birth to 2 years old in the growth of neurons and the increasing density, increasing synapses. Therefore, if there's a contaminant in the bloodstream of a baby that crosses the blood-brain barrier, there can be some adverse effects that occur when the toxicants, the pollutants or contaminants interfere with these growth processes of neurons. Finally, children put a lot of things in their mouths, as you all know well. This study that was published in 2007 was a video study of toddlers playing, and the researchers counted the number of times that children touched surfaces, put the hands to the mouth area, and then put either hands or objects in the mouth. And so you can see that children on average touch surfaces 83 times an hour, with as many as high as 405 times per hour. They put their hands to the mouth area, median of 35 times per hour, up to 129 times per hour. And they put things in their mouths, average of 21 times per hour, up to 126. So contaminants in their environment, specifically in house dust, either in homes or anywhere that children spend time, including in childcare environments or early childhood education environments, can be ingested. And for things like lead, which gets in house dust in old buildings when the paint breaks down, it doesn't take a lot of leaded dust to increase a child's lead levels. So hands to mouths and objects in mouths are a very important source of exposure to things that hang out in house dust. This slide shows these windows of susceptibility, which help us when we look at exposures during pregnancy and early childhood. And they illustrate that there are certain times during fetal development where different organ systems are affected by toxicants. If you look up at the first bar, the central nervous system is growing from 3 weeks to 20 years old. So the CNS is vulnerable all through that time, from early prenatal through postnatal up to 20 years. And if some of you have any kids over 20 years that are hanging out in your basement, living in your basement, you realize their brains are still growing. So the CNS is uniquely vulnerable for many years. When you look at the heart, for example, it develops from 3 to 8 weeks. There are some toxicants that affect only the cardiovascular system. So you can see that in the early prenatal period, if a mother is exposed to a toxicant that affects the heart, the fetus is vulnerable to heart defects. But if the mother is exposed in the late prenatal period, there won't be a problem with the heart because it's already developed. Same with the skeleton, lungs, reproductive system. It's the reproductive toxicants. I don't think this slide shows it really well, but can affect post-birth all the way through puberty. Next slide. This slide harkens back to the photograph that I showed at the beginning of the very thin child in the black and white photograph during the Dutch famine of World War II. And I mentioned a study that was conducted on offspring that were born of mothers who were pregnant during that starvation winter in the 1940s. And what came out of that study was this new concept called the developmental origins of adult disease, or the Barker hypothesis, published back in 1989. And it really opened our eyes to the fact that the placenta is not a very safe, sterile cocoon, that there are effects that the mother can be exposed to during pregnancy that affect the children even later in life. And what this study found is that for mothers who were in early gestation during the starvation winter, their offspring, when they became adults, had a 3-fold increase in coronary heart disease and obesity. So that meant starvation during early pregnancy resulted in these health effects later on in life of the offspring. If the mother was starving during mid-gestation, when the offspring grew up, there was an increase in obstructive airways disease. If mom was pregnant during that starvation winter during late gestation, the offspring grew up to have impaired glucose tolerance. We don't know why yet, and what's happening at those various stages of pregnancy that then lead to the problems in adulthood, but the important thing is that when mothers are exposed to toxicants or adverse conditions during pregnancy, you don't just get things like birth defects. You can cause these other types of health problems way in the future. I like to show this slide because it shows trends in reproductive outcomes that we think may be linked to environmental exposures. This study, Tracy Woodruff did a literature review, and these circles are just highlighting some of the studies so that it's not overwhelming. So if you look at the first circle, certain childhood cancers have increased from 20 to 24% between 1976 and 2005. ADHD has increased 3% per year. That circle also goes through some birth defects. Specifically, I wanted to point out cryptorchidism, which is blocked off. You can't see it well, but that's undescended testicles, has gone up by 200% since 1970. And then the third circle shows the reported difficulty conceiving and maintaining pregnancy, including in women less than 25 years old, increased 200% more. So why are these things happening? They may be linked to environmental exposures, and I want to show you some of the studies that document the data that may explain these trends. What are we exposed to? Let's look at that. We think we're exposed, well, it looks like we're exposed to a chemical soup. The reason that we call it a chemical soup is that there are now over 84,000 chemicals listed by the EPA. That's 84,000. There are around 700 new chemicals developed annually. 3,000 chemicals in general are high volume or exceed 1 million pounds of use per year. This is in the US. And the vast majority of these chemicals have not been researched or subjected to standard studies. That's a factor of how the chemical regulatory framework works in the US, that there are tens of thousands of chemicals in our environment for which we are not sure about health effects. Next slide. I like this slide because it's a great example of the research that is being done. We're talking just in the last 10 to 15 years, looking at what is in our bodies. We're getting much more sophisticated at being able to measure things in the body, measure chemicals and metabolites in the body. So there's just a plethora of studies out there. And this busy graph shows women who were recruited to be in the study and just gave blood samples. And each bar, each column is a different woman, and each color is a chemical that was found in her bloodstream. So you can see that all the 4 chemicals were found in every single woman, except for the dark blue. So that includes the purple, which are phthalates, they're plastic chemicals, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are petroleum products. The orange is flame retardants. The light blue is pesticides, the organochlorine pesticides. The gray is metals. That would be like mercury, cadmium, arsenic, lead. And then the dark blue is cotinine, which is a metabolite of cigarette smoke. So every one of these 54 women had all those chemicals, except some didn't have the cigarette smoke. This slide shows an example of the chemical that crosses the placenta, as most chemicals do. Each bar in this study is a mother-baby pair. So it's a mother and it's her infant that had blood taken from the cord at birth, which is an easy way to get a blood test showing what the fetus's blood levels were. So you don't have to stick the fetus, you can just get the blood from the cord. And the black bars are the mother's blood levels this is perfluorochemicals, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these are perfluorochemicals. They are stain removers and flame retardants and Teflon chemicals. So each mother had it, every mother in the study had the perfluorochemicals in her bloodstream. And then the light blue bars are the infants at birth. So this is not exposure after they were born. This is exposure in utero from the mother. And you'll notice that all the blue bars are higher than the black bars, showing that the fetus concentrated, or the placenta, concentrated these levels, and the fetus had higher blood levels of these flame retardant stain removers than the mothers. I'm going to take, I think there's just maybe 4 or 5 slides that show you some of this data, because a lot of scientists and researchers, academics, want to see the data. So I want to show it to you. There are lots of references that come from this report that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is a branch of the NIH, and the EPA put together from their funded research centers. So these are well-funded research centers scattered around the country that crank out great research on children's environmental health. This impact report is a summary of 20 years of findings of children's environmental health research. If anybody is interested in tracking down some of these references or perusing a lot more information about different types of chemicals and exposures that I'm not going to have time to go over, please access this report. It's available on the web. The first set of studies is on the effects to mothers and babies, mothers and children, of air pollution. This shows some of the main pollutants that we look at. Particulate matter is one that a lot of people don't know about, but we're finding lots and lots of health effects about. And particulate matter basically is very, very fine dust particles that are generated basically when anything is burned. And particulate matter comes mainly from burning, in our environment, comes mainly from burning fossil fuels. It can also be an indoor contaminant from wood burning stoves. And there's also indoor air pollution from the use of gas ranges. Nitrogen oxides are put off by indoor gas ranges. But you also see sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds. Those are petroleum products. Usually there's ozone and lots of other things listed here that are components of air pollution. Here's some health effects from air pollution. Once again, I picked out these from that impact report from the NIEHS EPA funded children's environmental health research centers. So there were several studies that have looked at lung function in young children. And the reason this is important is not only for the young child's health, but also because lung function can predict cardiopulmonary health later in life. Interestingly enough. And to measure lung function, this means how the air is getting in and out of the lungs. Is the air crossing the bronchioles into is the oxygen getting in? Are other things being carried with the oxygen into the bloodstream? And what they found is that they're associated with particulate matter exposure, that lung function was decreased. So that means they took a set of young children and they looked at the particulate matter that they were exposed to and then measured the lung function and found that children that were exposed to PM in their air, this could be indoors or outdoors, had decreased lung function. So there's a concern for what their cardiopulmonary health might be later in life. There was also a study that looked at children living within 500 meters of a freeway and looked at their lung function and also found deficits there. So they didn't measure specific pollutants, they just looked at how far away the children lived from the highway and found deficits in lung function. Several studies looked at pregnancy outcomes, so looked at what pregnant women were exposed to and then looked at the infant's health after birth. This first one looked at air pollutant exposure during pregnancy, so all types of air pollution during pregnancy, and found that there's a higher risk of preterm birth. So it looks like some of the chemicals like particulate matter and other types of air pollutants that were shown in the previous slide are in the mother's bloodstream, cross the placenta, and there's some reason that is not known at this time that there is an increased risk for that baby to be born early. The next one is a study of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are also given off by burning of fossil fuels, and looking at exposure during pregnancy. This is such an interesting study conducted in New York City, where there was a large cohort of women who were pregnant, and the researchers had the women wear these backpacks that had air monitors all during their pregnancy. So the monitors were sucking in the air around them, and then they followed the women during pregnancy, after pregnancy, and now some of these kids are teenagers, I think, and they're still publishing studies on what the effects of this air pollution in urban New York City had on the children. So this was one of the early ones showing that mothers that were exposed to higher levels of PAHs, and again, this is just walking down the street in urban traffic, had more adverse effects on both cognitive and behavioral development in the kids. And there are several studies on this, measuring the children at different ages, I think 3 and then 5 and 7. And the different studies were on both cognitive development and behavior, showing the relationship with higher PAH exposure. The next one is asthma. Of course, asthma is probably the most common environmentally related disease, and we know it's a severe issue among children who have to miss school and can't exercise because of their symptoms. And there are studies that have shown symptom flare-ups that are associated with diesel emissions, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and living closer to freeways. The next set of studies is on consumer products, which I find very interesting because they are around us all the time. We use them at home, we use them in child care centers, we use them in schools and early childhood education centers. And the set of studies looked first at BPA. So bisphenol A is a plasticizer that is used to be found in baby bottles. It's mostly been taken out now. It's found in food containers. It's still in can liners. BPA in can liners is probably our main source for all of us. And so there is a movement to try to get the BPA taken out of food can liners. Unfortunately, it's being replaced many times with BPS, which some of these research centers have been finding adverse effects from BPS as well. Anyway, so this study cited here showed that prenatal exposure to BPA, so measuring BPA levels in the moms, was associated with body fat, higher body fat and waist circumference at age 7. So there's a thought that this might be an obesogen or a chemical that is contributing to obesity. And then another study showed increased body fat in kids at age 9 related to the amount of BPA in the mothers during pregnancy. Another consumer product that I mentioned before, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PBDEs, which are flame retardants. This is a nice graphic that shows where flame retardants are found in the environment. Look at all these different products. You can see why that study that looked at pregnant women's bloodstreams, what was in pregnant women's blood, found flame retardants in every single participant. So these children's research centers have found that PBDEs during pregnancy are related to lower levels of thyroid hormone during pregnancy. And thyroid hormone is essential for fetal growth and development. The studies have found lower scores on mental development at age 1 and 4, 1 and 4 of the offspring associated with flame retardants in the mother during pregnancy, attention problems, and poor executive functioning. So it looks like these PBDEs might be associated, might be contributing to some of these attention and behavior problems. The third consumer product that I'm going to review is phthalates. I mentioned them earlier. They are plasticizers like BPA, although they are in plastic items that are usually bendable and more squishy. That's why there's a rubber ducky there. So they're in plastic products, children's toys. There's also a class of phthalates that are in perfumes, personal care products. They're used in industry. They carry scent, so a lot of our scented personal care products have phthalates. So this first column shows results of a study looking at levels of phthalates in household dust. Oh shoot, my computer just blanked out. Wake up. Oh, sensor power saving mode. Come on. Okay, I don't know why that happened. Sorry. So phthalates, yeah, I can't go over these results unless I can see it. Oh my gosh. Okay, hold on. I just got logged out. Sorry, I'm going to have to log back in.
Susan, you want us to just cover these 2 slides while you're logging back in?
Sure.
All right. So, as Dr. Buchanan was talking about the levels in household dust that were associated with developmental delays, is also associated with hyperactivity and impulsivity in male children. So there's a number of detrimental effects in studies on children. One of the hallmarks of a lot of this research is that they use parallel animal-human studies. It's obviously easier to study multiple generations, and particularly when it comes to dissecting brains, much easier to get through the IRB with animal studies. Animal studies looking at phthalates showed there was decreased sperm motility, an increase in ovarian cysts, and reduced fertility in those animal studies. So the next exposure that we know quite a bit about at this point is exposure to pesticides. And children are exposed to pesticides in multiple ways, but they can be exposed indoor and outdoor. So there's outdoor associated with farming and pesticide drift. So for children living near high farming areas, they can be exposed through pesticides carried in wind. The organophosphate pesticides, studies showed that there was a prenatal exposure was associated with poor cognitive functioning in the offspring. There were attention problems at age 5, impulsivity and hyperactivity among boys at age 5, inattention among girls at age 5, and loss of up to 7 IQ points at age 7, which is an enormous drop. The chlorpyrifos, the results showed that children were exposed to higher levels. Children exposed to higher levels showed lower scores on mental development testing at age 3 and lower IQ at age 7. What's really interesting about these studies, these were done in the Salinas Valley in California, and the cohort here is now they're now young teenagers and actually early 20s, and they are starting to have children too. So this is going to be one of the first studies where we do have multiple generation information on exposures and outcomes. So we're really excited to keep seeing what comes out of that center. So next slide.
And Brenda,
as I mentioned,
Brenda, you're doing such a great job, and this is really the last slide I think that I was going to show before I turned it over to you, so you could just continue. It's fine with me. However, I cannot get back onto, for some reason I can't get back onto the webinar website, so I'm not going to see the questions. I'm using my own set of slides.
Okay. So, well, you want to cover this last slide? You're doing, no, I don't want to take this under, but okay, well, so pesticides, one of the other exposure pathways is through farming. And one of the things that children in the Chacamo study were children of agricultural workers. And one of the things that they found is one of the ways that those children were exposed to pesticides, even though they were not working in the field, was that their parents, who were farm workers, were actually carrying home pesticide residue on their clothing and skin. And there were higher levels found in the homes and the vehicles of those farm workers compared to non-farm workers. And one of the really interesting interventions they tried in this Chacamo study, and that was successful, is that they created a campaign to have those farm workers actually take their shoes and clothes off before they entered the home. And that ended up showing that they were able to greatly reduce the exposure that their children had when they followed those practices. So why should we care about some of these exposures? I think as developmental scientists, most everyone on cares. But for everyone else, I think, you know, sometimes people really respond to money. And one of the things, there's some studies, and if you want to see the citations for the studies that developed these numbers. You can go to the impact report, which is in the handouts of the webinar. So it was estimated that $2.2 billion could be attributed to environmental factors for the annual cost of childhood asthma, which we know is increasing. That the overall figure of $76.6 billion is the annual cost of environmentally related diseases in U.S. children, and that there's a lifetime earnings loss of up to $15,000 as a result of the loss of 1 IQ point. So when you think about that study where children have lost up to 7 IQ points, that can have a significant impact. So there's certainly, if what you care about are dollars, and most people do in some sense of their life, there's a fiscal monetary reason to care about these environmental exposures. So you might be wondering, how were chemicals regulated? Well, up until 1976, they weren't. But the Toxic Controlled Substances Act of 1976 was the first time that chemicals were federally regulated in some form. It authorized the EPA to regulate chemicals that were found in consumer products, such as cleaning agents, furniture, paint, carpeting, clothing. And yet, as of 2005, EPA had performed reviews of only 2,000 of the, remember the figure that Dr. Buchanan gave, 62,000 pre-1969 chemicals. And that is really an outdated figure because, as we know, there are more and more chemicals that are added each year. There have only been 5 chemicals that have been restricted or banned since the T.C.S.A. was put in place in 1976. And one of the other important hallmark features of this regulation was that the burden of proof on the EPA was to prove that the chemical was harmful. So they first had to prove that the chemical harmed health before they could take any action to restrict or ban it. There are a lot of advocates that have worked for a number of years to finally have a renewed or kind of a policy that would have and some legislation that would have a little more teeth in it. In 2016, the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act was passed and signed by President Obama. It requires, let's talk about the things that are wonderful improvements over the previous legislation, which is that it now requires the EPA to review the safety for all chemicals in the United States in active use. It requires the EPA to prioritize chemicals for evaluation and giving priority to those with large exposure potential, that are environmentally persistent, or those that don't break down over time, or that bioaccumulate, that means build up in the body, or stored near water sources. It requires a safety finding for chemicals before they can enter the market. And it also, this is another addition that a lot of organizations and scientists thought to have included is that it requires the EPA to consider the impacts of chemical exposures on those most susceptible to those effects. And it gives examples such as infants, children, pregnant women, workers, or the elderly. However, how the EPA defines susceptible and vulnerable is yet to be determined. It also shifted the analysis burden to a health-based risk evaluation and environmental safety standard instead of a cost-benefit standard. So there's still some things that don't make this as, I mean, you may think, okay, we've got the problem solved, but in fact, there are still some challenges, even though we have this new legislation in place. The work done under this law will depend on funding, and the way that the legislation was written is some of that funding is to come from chemical companies themselves. So it really is kind of a year-to-year according to the federal budget around how much money the EPA is going to have to put towards accomplishing these goals. Also, this act does not regulate pesticides or chemicals in cosmetics or personal care products, food food packaging or pharmaceuticals. Just to give you an example of what that would mean, it would give the power to the EPA to regulate BPA when it was used in a receipt coding, like when you go to the grocery store and you get that oddly kind of plasticky paper receipt that typically has BPA in it. And this act gives the EPA the ability to regulate BPA in that setting, but not when it's used in food packaging. So that would fall into the purview of the FDA. So this is actually a little infographic that one of our research assistants created after she had learned a little bit about chemical exposures in children's health, and sent it to us kind of as a joke. And I think it's pretty apt, because frequently what happens when people learn, when we get to this point of talking about all this of the effects and the exposures and the impact, it can feel a little overwhelming. So rather than leaving you overwhelmed, we'd like to talk a little bit about what kind of resources you have and steps you can take and recommend to others to help reduce your exposure. Some of the simple things that you can do to reduce your exposure and to reduce children's exposure is to wash hands regularly, not just for the flu season. Washing hands before eating can help reduce, especially for children in childcare environments, that can help reduce any of the dust exposure that Dr. Buchanan was talking about from getting in the mouth. Go fragrance-free, or at least try to reduce fragrances. In a childcare center, it should be a fragrance-free environment entirely. So sometimes in homes, people do want some fragrances, but you really try to think about reducing your use of products that have fragrance. Another one, as Dr. Buchanan mentioned, household dust. My mother always told me that a little dust wouldn't kill you. Not sure she's 100% right. Maybe not kill me, but it may have some adverse health impacts. So you want to vacuum and wet dust frequently. Wet dusting windowsills, especially in older homes or and when we think about childcare environments that are older and aging, wet dusting windowsills, it does double duty, because both that can, any of the powdered or chipping paint that may have lead, you're reducing that. And then also as kind of the air blows in, it's not blowing about the room. The other is to use glass instead of plastic. Dr. Buchanan talked about the BPA free. So 4 years, one of the things that some of us who are working to kind of translate and provide information to people about what to do to reduce your exposures, we have something we call regrettable substitutions. So 4 years ago, we were telling folks to look for BPA free, and that was a way to reduce your exposure. But one of the things that we've learned is there's that regrettable substitution of what they're calling BPS. And so we don't know what's being substituted in these products. So the best thing to do is to, when possible, avoid using plastic as much as you can. Certainly try to avoid heating foods or storing high acid foods in plastic. Another easy tip, and this could also be applied in a childcare environment, is to have a shoes off policy. So this again reduces the amount of pesticides, lead in dirt that's tracked in. So it's there's been a couple studies that have shown that this has been efficacious in reducing exposures indoor. The other is to try and eat organic when possible. So the other places to go to find more information, on the upper left, you can see that is the Safer Choice logo that is that the EPA has. You can go to the EPA website to find out the product and ingredient criteria that they use for a product to earn the label. They also have one for fragrance-free, because some of the things, it's a little tricky around what is precisely fragrance-free, but they have one that is fragrance-free, so you can look for that as well. Below that is an app that is the Environmental Working Group, Skin Deep. They are evaluating a number of consumer care products and cosmetics You can also look for it online, and they give as best they can their assessment of chemicals, and you can see kind of the green, yellow, red. Green is it's fine. Yellow is like there's a little caution, and red is if they've determined that it has a toxic burden. In the middle is from Silent Spring, a Detox Me app. There's a number of different settings in which there's a home setting, there's childcare setting, where it kind of takes you through different ways that you can reduce your toxic exposures. The Environmental Working Group also has a label that they have verified that this is toxic free. I'm going to be quite upfront. I'm not entirely sure how they assess getting this label, but the Environmental Working Group is really a good resource to also get additional information. Below that is Project Tender. Project Tender is a group of scientists, and the number of them are directors of children's centers, and they came together and really talked. What they wanted to do was to identify the exposures that were really the most troublesome that contributed to neurodevelopment. And they have additional information on their website about how they determine that and what those exposures are. But then they also have a tremendous list of resources that both studies as well as other tip sheets and how you can reduce exposures.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here just to give you an idea about where some of this work is being done. There are, across the United States, there are pediatric environmental health specialist units. Dr. Buchanan is associated with Region 5, and they offer medical consultation to healthcare providers, public health and environmental agencies, as well as community groups. Many of them will refer to specialized medical resources when necessary, and they're a great resource for information in this area. We also mentioned this is the Great Lakes Center for Children's Environmental Health, where Dr. Buchanan resides. Each one of these centers, each PESU has an information line that you can call in with questions. They may not get back to you within a couple of hours, but they'll certainly get back to you within the next day or so. As mentioned before, the National Institute of Environmental, if you can go on to the next slide, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and the EPA supports 24 centers that have been funded since 1997. And these are dispersed across the country, although most of them are on either the east or the west coast. And each one of these centers addresses different exposures that can affect children's health and development. And a key part of that is that each center has what's referred to as a community outreach and translation core to make sure that communities are aware of different environmental exposures, and also to have communities of interest inform the science that's being conducted. Next slide. So here in Illinois, the community that we're focusing on are child care providers. And the exposures that we're interested in have been endocrine disrupting chemicals and their effects on reproduction and neural development. And so I just want to share with you a little bit of what our work has been in that area. Next slide. So we initially conducted a conference with child care providers across the state, assuming that they had a basic understanding about environmental exposures and children's environmental health. And what we found is that we really targeted our communication in the wrong way. Because when we surveyed them, they really didn't think that things like air quality, chemicals and plastics, fragrances, personal care products posed a threat to children's environmental health. However, after they heard Dr. Buchanan's talk, they radically changed their minds. And they got quite energized about what could they possibly do. So what we've done, next slide, this is where we started thinking this is what we were going to talk about in terms of children's environmental health. And we were going to focus on phthalates and tricycline disruptors. But this, next slide, this is really what child care providers want to know about. They want to know about all of the environmental exposures and what kinds of actions they can take to reduce exposure. So next slide. So when we talk to child care providers, when we say environment, they're thinking either environment in terms of climate change, the broader environment, recycling, or, as many of you know, they're also thinking about the environment in their childcare setting, like social emotional environment. And so what we're doing at this point is we are conducting in-depth interviews with child care providers to develop some more effective messaging with providers so that they can be called to action to do things in reasonable ways to protect children's health in the settings in which they care for children. Okay, so I think we now can open it up for questions. I know one of the questions that was sent to us earlier on was, can you compare environmental exposures in the home versus childcare? And that was such a great question, and I wish I had an answer. Nobody's really done a comparative study of that sort. Brenda mentioned that there have been studies that have looked at children's exposures to particular kinds of contaminants like pesticide, as well as different kinds of exposures to air pollution and exposures to tobacco smoke. But no one has really looked at a comparative analysis within a child care setting versus within a home. And some of this would be very, very difficult to tease out, given that children are exposed all day long, and it would be difficult on a child level to look at that, but you could look at it within different contexts.
Barb, that said, this is Dr. Buchanan, I think it could be mentioned, though, that the exposures are probably going to be similar. Some of them are going to be similar between home and the child care environment. The things that would really come, that I would worry about the most are lead. If it's an old child care environment and there's some deteriorating paint or the windows have not been replaced since they were original, because opening and closing those windows can pulverize the dust. And so I would worry about lead, but things that collect in dust might be lower in child care environments because they keep them so clean compared to at least my house. And so one of the, like Brenda mentioned, one of the main things is the wet dusting that can keep up the house dust. So that might be better in child care environments. And, the toys might be cleaned more often. The sheets on the cribs might be changed more often so they're not collecting the dust. But in child care environments compared to homes, they may use more chemicals and cleaners. They might use more pesticides, bait traps if they're having ants, certainly, spraying for cockroaches or any type of other types of pesticides. And they can be oversprayed because people are very concerned about having any types of bugs in the child care environment. And so that can be a real source of poor air quality, or if the bait traps, kids can get into them. So, they can be similar to home, but also may have their own unique characteristics.
And I think this is one of the things that we're learning, is that sometimes the licensing regulations, require that centers and home-based providers engage in, certain cleaning practices. Here in Illinois, it is against policy regulations to have glass baby bottles. So,
which unfortunately would be preferable. Yeah, it would be preferable to have the glass baby bottles.
Some safety concerns with others. So I think for many providers, it's a dilemma. We have another question here, Susan. I don't know if you want to take this. Do we have a sense of children's exposure levels across varying SES levels?
The main exposure that we do see a difference is with lead. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic status you are, you can live in a house that is old enough that it has lead-based paint. However, when the lead is in the paint in underlayers, if it's since been painted over and there are new windows, the chance of exposure is much less than in a home that hasn't been painted since then, that has older windows, that might have some, even if the house has been painted over indoors, the paint might be deteriorating around the baseboards or in the corners, so that children are more highly exposed. So we do see that in underserved neighborhoods, that there are more children that have lead exposure, and that's only because of the deterioration of the houses. The housing is not kept up. I don't know that there are a lot of differences between among other exposures. I do know with mercury exposure, there is some higher mercury exposure from fish in people who can afford to eat the larger fish. So tuna steaks and tuna sushi have much higher mercury levels than canned tuna, and some of the smaller fish that are cheaper. So they do find higher mercury levels in higher socioeconomic classes because of that, and swordfish. So swordfish, tuna steaks, tuna sushi.
Any other questions? Well, I would encourage the attendees to take a look at the impact report that was prepared by NIEHS and EPA. It has some really, really good information in it. Feel free to distribute it widely among your colleagues. It's meant to be a resource for people. We hope that you find this information useful. We believe that this is an area that developmental scientists have a great opportunity to contribute and to contribute to the science of environmental health and children's development.
Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you to our speakers for such a thought-provoking presentation. If you liked today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. Please check the consortium listserv and website for information about upcoming webinars. If you would like to present a webinar later this year, please visit the consortium website or email me, Patricia Barton. We are still looking for several more webinar ideas for 2018, and we would love to hear from you. You can also join the consortium listserv. You can also join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, a quarterly newsletter, as well as job and event announcements. In my follow-up email, I will attach a copy of today's slides, the impact report referenced during the presentation, and a link to today's webinar, which was recorded and will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.